Okay, sorry, I'm going to continue. I had like a kid issue pop up. So the word help meet. So help is a word that in every other instance in which it's used in the Old Testament, it describes God and the kind of help God gives. And then meet is like this complementary piece that stands in front of you and helps you learn and grow. And so Eve's role in this story is to give the kind of help only God can give, and to be the kind of complementary piece or opposition that stands in front of you that helps you learn and grow. And so if that's what Eve was created to be, then when we get to the part where she eats of the tree, then maybe that was actually what she was created to do, was to move the plot forward by providing like this divine help. It's like veiled. It's like a veiled divine help. It's not, because over here he's telling Adam not to eat of the fruit, right? And people will say, well, it feels like maybe God was setting them up. And I would say, yes, that's exactly right, because that's what I've been trying to say this whole time, is God has been setting up the creation so that there would be opposition in it, and so that, the stuff would, so we could be tested right from the get-go. He didn't have to include, on day one, he didn't have to include darkness in the creation. In fact, in the new heavens and new earth, there won't be any darkness. He didn't have to include any of the waters of chaos in the new creation, because in the new heavens and new earth, there won't be any waters of chaos. Like, that's the point I've been trying to make, is that, yes, God set it up for us to be proved and tested. And Eve is the one that's helping him do that. That's the story that's being told, I think. And that Eve will push, but she has to do it. She has to do it, not God, because in order to move the story forward, she has to do something that will separate them from God, right? So that it'll kind of activate the negative forces in the world, so that darkness will have more sway, so that chaos will have more sway. If it's Eden the whole time, you and I will never learn anything. So like, it's this weird dynamic that had to be set up, and God was setting it up, but he also needed a helper, a divine helper, to push the story forward, and that is Eve. So he needed a divine helper to push the story forward, and that is Eve. And in the story. Okay, so let me focus on the trees now for just a second. If you notice, this tree of knowledge of good and evil, if you eat it, you die, okay? Now, if you guys remember, I said that God did not create death. The forces, the darkness was always there. The principles of darkness and evil are kind of always there. God is the one who overcomes them, who defeats them, right? And so, death is, he's incorporating, just like he incorporated darkness into day one, or chaos into day two, or chaos into day three, and the sea dragons, into day 5. Like, he's purposely incorporating bad things into the creation so that we can be tested. He's purposely incorporating death again through this tree into the creation, so that there's opposition. As Lehi said, without the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there's nothing to entice Adam and Eve one way or the other. There's no opposition. There's no like real test of our agency, okay? And so this stuff that's pre-existent, that's always been there, God is incorporating it in so that it will test us. And then later, he will cast it out into outer darkness. It won't be a part of the heavens and the earth, the new heavens and new earth, but it'll still exist. It'll just be out there in the outer darkness, okay? All right, so this tree, but the point I want to make is naming is really important. As part of creation, God, speaks, and then he divides, and then he names, and then even Adam names animals here in Genesis 2, and naming gives something its purpose and its identity. So God, just like on day one, when he takes darkness and he incorporates it into the creation, he gives it a purpose, and he calls it night. He gives it a purpose. He's like, now darkness, you're part of my creation, and you'll be part of this cycle of time that goes round and round that tests us. Well, here he's saying, I'm going to give death another purpose. Death's purpose is to provide knowledge of good and evil. You see, so only God can do that. God takes death and he gives it a new name. And that new name is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Death on its own won't do that. But death combined with God's power gives you knowledge of good and evil. So that's a testimony of how awesome God is. Death on its own is awful. It's terrible. But if you combine death, a pre-existing thing, with the power of God, with God's power to be able to give things names and give it purpose and identity, then it becomes a source of knowledge of good and evil. So I want to point that out. Like, God is the one that gives it its name, just like he gave darkness the name night, and just like he gave chaos the name sea, right? Just like he organized the dragons and put them in a place so that they have a role in his creation, God is putting death in and giving it a role, and that role is good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil. But it can't be had without him. That's the point. If you and I try to get knowledge of good and evil through death without him, you just die, okay? But if you try to get knowledge of good and evil through death with him, then you get it. And that's why we need the atonement. The atonement later on actually makes this promise. Like, you can't have this knowledge of good and evil through death unless Jesus comes later to do his part through the atonement and resurrection and everything. Then death doesn't exist anymore, right? You overcome death, but all the benefits of death, the knowledge and experience we gain, we still carry with us, right? So it's all right here, okay? And lastly, the same thing's happening over here when he says there's a tree of life. The tree of life, I mean, the source of life, you guys, is not a tree. The source of life and light is God, okay? And what he's doing, he's just channeling that life and light. He's through the tree to us. And just like I said on day 2, that you needed a firmament, and on day 4, you needed sun, moon, and stars to kind of channel God's light and glory into the world, because we were leaving his immediate presence in like celestial realms and going down into a lower realm. We couldn't handle his full presence anymore, so we needed something to mediate between us and him, something that could channel his glory and light so that it doesn't overwhelm us. And that was the firmament, and that's the sun and the moon and stars. Well, the tree of life is also that same thing. It has the same function. It channels his life and light into our lives so that we aren't overwhelmed by his life and light when we're in a lower state, okay? So that's the tree of life. And I'm going to dive in now into some concepts about the tree of life and then wrap it up, okay? So, and now I just want to point out, I said before that the firmament was kind of represented the veil in the temple, and then later on we're told that the veil represents Jesus's body, right? And we're also, the sun and moon and the stars, I said are kind of like testaments of Christ, because that's his role. He comes into this life and he tabernacles with us. His body veils all the grace and truth that's inside of him. It's veiled through his body, but he lets it out every now and then so that you and I can live like the woman that touches his robe. A little bit of the grace and truth, a little bit of the light and glory that's inside of him poured out into her to heal her. But it was mediated through his body because his body was veiling like the fullness so that she wouldn't be overwhelmed by him. That's the same concept, right? And that's what's happening here with the tree. The tree is doing that, but the tree represents Jesus. Okay, we're going to get into that. But let's do a couple other things first, okay? So we'll go to Ezekiel. There's some really cool stuff about trees. There's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just going to cover a couple of things because I've already been going a while. And it'll just a couple of items will like show my point. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 31. Ezekiel is prophesying about the kings of this world in Ezekiel chapter 31, and the Lord tells him. Okay, let's read a little bit. The Lord tells him, verse 2, Son of man, speak unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his multitude. Whom art thou like in thy greatness? So he says, tell Pharaoh this. Who are you like? Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches, and with a shadowing shroud, and of an high stature, and his top was among the thick boughs. And sometimes people interpret that word boughs as like the clouds. Okay, so this is an oracle to the Pharaoh that says, hey, Pharaoh, you shouldn't be so high and mighty on yourself, because don't you remember the king of Assyria? He used to be like a tall cedar of Lebanon whose height reached up into the clouds, who had a high stature. Doesn't it start to sound like the Tower of Babel? And that's the point. It is going to sound like the Tower of Babel. And he says, but it's with a tree imagery instead of a tower. The waters made him great. The deep set him up on high with her rivers running around about his plants. So the reason why this tree grew so tall with its boughs like way up high was because its roots went way down deep into the waters below, into the chaos waters below that fed it, okay? And then sent out her little rivers unto all the trees of the field. So then it pulled up, the imagery is it's pulling the waters of chaos up and then like letting it seep out from the base of the tree and turn into rivers that feed the rest of the world. Okay. So that's actually the image in the Garden of Eden. Later on, rabbis, that's how they interpreted the Garden of Eden, because it says that there was a river that came out of Eden, and when it got to the Garden of Eden, it split into 4 rivers. This is in Genesis chapter 2, right? And the rabbis connected that to the tree. They said it came out from the tree of life and broke into 4 rivers that went out and fed the whole world. So the tree is the source of water and life to the whole world, just like in this image here. Okay? Then it says, therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shot forth. And all the fowls of heaven made their nests in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under his shadow dwelt all great nations. So it got so big, basically all of the earth, all the animals and birds and all of the earth, like, were able to be sheltered by its branches and live off of its fruit. It was a tree of life, like this. So the king of Assyria, basically, is being compared to a tree of life because he was so mighty and powerful that he provided protection for everyone in his empire and provided food for everyone in his empire. He was like a tree of life, okay? And then God goes on to say, the cedars in the garden of God could not hide him, and the fir trees were not like his boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like his branches, nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in beauty. So the king of Assyria was greater than any tree in the garden of God. What's the garden of God? The Garden of Eden. So meaning, this is, without saying it, what it's trying to say poetically is that the king of Assyria was like a tree of life. Again, the greatest tree in the garden of God. And that it was taller than everything else, and it provided water and food and shelter, okay? And then because he's high and lifted up, he gets cut down, and because of his pride. And the oracle is to say, Pharaoh, the same thing's going to happen to you. You're getting high and mighty on your own, you're getting drunk off of your own awesomeness, and you're going to be like this king of Assyria who was cut down, okay? But the reason why I'm showing you guys this is because the imagery, like Ezekiel is using the imagery of the Garden of Eden and the tree of life to describe what's going to happen to kings in the world, to describe not only what's going to happen to them, but like what their purpose is. Just like the tree of life was to be a canopy that shielded people, gave them shade from the full blast of the sun, right? It's like a veil that protects you from the full blast of light and glory, but also lets enough light and glory through so that you can live, and then also provides water that pulls it up from the waters of chaos. So it takes the waters of chaos and then provides it in a way that gives you life instead of chaos, pulls it up from the beneath and makes it rivers of water, and then also makes fruit for you to eat. So basically, like, solves the problem of too much chaos and too much light and glory, and then also scarcity of food. It like solves all these problems, right? That's what the tree of life does. Because the tree of life does that, has that function. That's the function of a king in the ancient world too, was to do all those things, protect you from death and too much whatever, blah, 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 and provide food and water, okay? So because a king is like that, shares that functionality, then Ezekiel was able to use the imagery of the tree of life to say, you're going to be cut down, okay, because you're too proud, all right? So then let me go to Daniel chapter 4. The same thing happens, okay? Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has a dream. And he's in his dream, it says, I thought, okay, oops, sorry. It's over here. He says in verse 10, thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw and beheld a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. See, in the midst, that's where the tree of life was too, is in the middle of the garden, and the Garden of Eden's in the middle of the earth, you could say. Okay, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, like the Tower of Babel, okay? And the sight thereof to the end of all the earth, okay? And then it goes on to say, like, all the animals fed from it and everything, just like this other tree that was being just used in Ezekiel. And then later on it says that the tree gets cut down, and Daniel says, O King Nebuchadnezzar, you're the tree, because you're like a tree of life to everyone in the world. You provide them food and shelter, and you also protect them from death and chaos. But you're going to get so high and mighty on yourself, you're going to get cut down. Okay, so this interesting dynamic where kings are likened unto trees of life because they share the same function. But notice the properties of the tree. It's tall, it reaches up unto heaven, and it's roots reach down into the waters of chaos below, and it protects from the full blast of the sun, and it protects from the full blast of chaos, and gives life and light and food through the way it functions, right? And so I want to point out one more thing. The Tower of Babel reaches unto heaven, okay? In the book, in the Old Testament, this idea of reaching into heaven is like a cultural phrase, just like image of God is a cultural phrase that has all this cultural meaning to it. So is reaching up unto heaven. Because look at Deuteronomy 1:28. Yeah. So this is the Israelites are going into the promised land, and it says, whither shall we go up? They're like murmuring about going, right? Our brethren have discouraged our heart, saying, the people is greater than and taller than we. The cities are great and walled up to heaven. And moreover, we have seen the sons of Anakims there. I remember when we read this verse in one of my classes, my Hebrew teacher said, isn't it funny they talk about the city walls there being walled up to heaven, and when you go do the archaeological digs, the walls are like, 5 or 6 feet high. So this is clearly like metaphorical speech. The walls really weren't even that tall, really. The reason why, though, they're barriers that protect you from death, right? They're barriers that protect you from the chaos that's outside of the city. They've served the same function as the tree of life. They serve the same function as a king. So I'm trying to get you guys to understand, in the ancient world, if you had similar functions, you could compare and contrast those things together and use imagery of one to talk about the other. And this is the idea here. The Tower of Babel and a city wall and a tree of life and a king all have similar functions. Their point is they're there to connect you to heaven. They reach all the way up to heaven, but they're also meant to protect you and shade you from the full blast of heaven because you're not ready for it. But they also connect you to life through the waters of chaos. Not too much chaos, not enough that will drown you, but just enough to give you life through water, because you need chaos in your life. You need chaos, remember, is potential. It can, you need to be renewed through water and the potential of life over and over again, but not too much of it, or else it'll drown you. And these things also protect you from the chaos of the wilderness, right? And that's so if you see the similarity of their functions, you can see why biblical writers will use the same terminology to describe a wall and a tree and a king and a tower, right? And so my point I'm getting at is that let me say one more thing. The rabbis have all these legends where, like, the tree of life's branches, and to go up the trunk of the tree of life would take 500 years, and if you were to go walk the length of a branch, it would take 500 years. And the reason why they say that is because they think that it would take 500 years to walk the length of the earth. So the idea is that the tree of life, in the rabbinic thinking and like Jewish legends, is that the tree of life was as tall and as wide as the earth, like its branches reached out as wide as the earth. And that's why in the past, when you guys have seen me draw the creation story, here's like the firmament, right? And there's waters above that are, like the chaos, right? And then here's the earth beneath it, right? And there's waters below that are chaos. But I drew it in the past, like here's the tree of life, and its branches reach out and like support the canopy of the firmament above. That's the imagery that is being set up in the Bible in these verses I'm showing you, but then later fleshed out in rabbinic legends, okay? And then the roots reach down into the waters below, okay? And the idea is that the tree is drawing up the waters and letting them seep out, and then protecting from the full blast of light and waters up here, and then providing fruit. And so it basically provides life. Okay, it's like a pillar. It's a pillar of the earth. It's actually called an axis mundi. It's a pillar of the world that holds your ceiling up and keeps your floor together. Like if you get rid of the tree, the earth floats away and disintegrates in the waters, and the canopy collapses. Everything falls apart. Okay, so it's like the tree of life because it holds everything together and makes life possible. That's the image. Okay, and so when Adam and Eve are cut off from the tree of life, it's like that's why you die. And notice it in Genesis 1, it says they could eat from every tree of the garden and even in Genesis 2, it says chapter 1 and chapter 2, it says they can eat from every tree except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because that's death, right? So they can eat from the tree of life before they're kicked out of the garden. It's after they're kicked out of the garden that they can't eat from it anymore. And the reason why I want to make that point is because life is dynamic. It has to be constantly sustained. You have to constantly be eating from the tree in order to be sustained by it. It wasn't static in the garden. It wasn't like they were made and they were just sitting around. Like you have to, just like it said in Genesis 2, Adam and Eve had to maintain the garden. Like if you don't maintain life, it will fall apart. It will die. Okay. And so God didn't just set up the world and then walk away from it like it's a machine that just runs on its own. He has to sustain it from moment to moment with his presence and his spirit. Adam and Eve have to help participate by sustaining the garden moment to moment. You and I have to do that on a daily basis. We have to eat and nourish ourselves physically and spiritually in order to live on a moment to moment basis. That is like the way this works. There's never a moment where you get to stop. If you stop, then you dissolve into chaos and you die. Your world collapses on you. That's the image, okay? Like that's the way the cosmos works. That's the way it's written into the fabric of things, and it can't be changed. So the sooner, we always think, oh, I can't wait till I don't have to do this anymore. Well, no, you're going to have to try to eat from the tree of life your whole forever if you want to live forever. And the way you do that, and the tree of life is just a symbol of Jesus Christ, okay? That's what First Nephi tells us. If you go to the vision about the vision of the tree of life, First Nephi 11, what Nephi wants to know the meaning of the tree, and what does God show him? He shows him Jesus Christ being born into the world. See, that's why, is because they had been cut off from the tree, so their whole world is collapsing. So God has to reestablish the tree in the world so that it can sustain the whole world again. That's what that vision and imagery means. It's not just about, it is about us overcoming sin and death, but you have to understand it in cosmic proportions, not in just like simple little, like, oh, I did something bad. And yes, it is something little for us. It matters for us in our personal. I'm not trying to minimize like the personal aspect of this. I'm just trying to emphasize there's a cosmic scale to this too. Like everything literally falls apart if you don't have the tree holding it all up and together. And Jesus is the one doing that. He is the tree of life. And when you get cut off from this tree, God has to remake the world basically by putting a new tree in place. And he has to plant it again. And that's what Nephi is seeing when he sees Jesus being born to Mary. It's God replanting. Like literally, Mary represents the earth, right? She's like a women. There are two things in Genesis 1 that reproduce after their own kind. It's the earth and women. So because she's like a little piece of earth that reproduces. And so God plants seed in Mary and produces Jesus, which is a new tree of life. And Jesus's role is to take the waters of chaos and make them into rivers of life for us. His role is to protect us from the full blast of God's glory, but let enough of his light filter into our lives so that we don't die. His role is to hold up the world for us so that you and I can run around in here and play and have fun and live life. His role is to take water and light and combine them so that they turn into fruit that you and I can eat. Okay? Like his role is to turn death into life, chaos into life, God's glory into life for us. Okay? Now in 1 Nephi chapter 8, I want to read a couple of verses with you to change the way you read the vision. When Lehi sees the vision, starting in verse right here. He says, I saw in my dream a dark and dreary wilderness. So from now on, when you read Lehi's dream, I want you to connect this to the creation story. Lehi is starting in dark and dreary wilderness. He's starting in the chaos. Okay? And a man in a white robe comes to meet him. Who could that be? It doesn't tell us, but I'm going to tell you, I'm going to propose it's Jesus, because that's the story of creation. Jesus is a man in a white robe who descends down into the chaos to give it meaning. And Lehi follows the man in the white robe, okay? And he saw that he was in a dark and dreary waste. Waste is like the right out of the Genesis. The earth was without form and void. A lot of times people translate void as waste, okay? And after he traveled many hours in darkness, he prayed, and the Lord answered his prayer, and he beheld a large and spacious field. So it's like the earth has been made, okay? And there's a tree there whose fruit makes you happy. There's the tree of life holding it all together, making it all work. And if you come on down, there's a river of water that flows along by the tree, just like we've been talking about, right? And it says that he saw, I'm going to skip on down, he saw a rod of iron extending along from the tree. Now, you and I think of this as like a rod that's set up independent of the tree. This should be seen as a branch of the tree extending out. And this is actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a tree that has metal wrapped around its branches, okay, and like gold and silver and iron and different things. And this connects, if you think of the tree as like the kings, because a king holds a rod of iron in his hands to rule over people. It's the scepter of a king, the rod of iron. And that's actually in Psalms chapter 2. It says that King David will have a rod of iron to rule over the nations. But the rod is made out of wood underneath, and then it's encased in iron. And so it's actually a branch. And all of the ancient cultures would say that wood came from the tree of life. I think the Assyrians say it about their king's scepter. The Egyptians say it about their king's scepter. Everyone says this about their king's scepter, is that it's made out of a branch from the tree of life. So you should see this rod of iron as a branch extending out from the tree of life. So it's connecting the tree with kingship, just like Ezekiel and Daniel did. Except in this case, the king is Jesus. Okay? And that because later on when Nephi asks what's the rod of iron, he sees Jesus going forth among the people and teaching them and healing them. He is the word that goes forth among the people, right? And so he's the tree and the rod, because the rod is part of the tree. Okay, and it's through his word that he will govern the nations. He'll govern over everything and rule over everything. It's through his word that he'll bring us over the gulf of misery and woe and through the midst of darkness and everything. And that's the thing. It talks about a fountain that springs up just like out of the tree. It talks about mists of darkness. Where have we seen mists of darkness before? Pre-creation in Genesis chapter 1, right? So, and then, all of these symbols. Oh, and then there's a great and spacious building. And that great and spacious building should be compared to the Tower of Babel. Just in the story of Genesis, we'll get there. The Tower of Babel is part of this whole story of after the fall, of an attempt to try to recreate Eden. And that's connected to that whole idea of the tower reaches unto heaven, and it's so they can make a name for themselves and all this stuff and not be scattered. And they're trying to get away from the east. It has all the markings of them trying to recreate Eden. They just do it the wrong way. Just like the people in the great and spacious building are trying to create community and everything, but they're doing it in the wrong way because it's built on their pride, just like the Tower of Babel was built on their pride. And so the only real way to get the benefits of the tree of life is to come to the tree of life, which represents Jesus Christ. Okay? So I just want to point that out. I'm going to stop for now because I've been going for a long time. But I hope you guys are seeing the benefits of really taking your time and pondering on the imagery and the symbolism of creation, because it connects to every story about the vision of the tree of life, or the kings that of Assyria and Pharaoh, that Ezekiel's later prophesying to. It all connects, and these images and symbols come up over and over and over again. It's in the Tower of Babel. It's in the walls of the cities of Canaan when the Israelites are trying to come in, and the walls are up to heaven. All that imagery comes from this story about the Garden of Eden. Okay? All right. Talk to you guys later.